It is a miracle that I'm even here. My story of coming to Croatia is a story of redemption. It's a story of healing. It's a story of taking me from a place of brokenness to a place of victory. And so if you would like to find out how I came to live in Croatia, stay tuned. Welcome back to another video. I am Roslyn Jukic. I am a second-generation homeschool mom living in Croatia, and today I am sharing my story with you about how I came to live in Croatia. I came to Croatia in October 2004, and I came here as a single person, and I met my husband here, and that's a story for another day. But how did I come to live in Croatia? I am a Pacific Northwest native. I was actually born in Ontario, Canada, but my parents moved back to the States when I was about between 2 and 4 years old. I don't exactly remember when, but when I was about somewhere around 5 years old, we moved to the Pacific Northwest, where my dad was actually born and raised. We moved to Tumwater, Washington, and that's pretty much where I spent all of my growing up years, between Washington and Oregon. And in 2004, I made the long journey from the Portland International Airport to Zagreb, Croatia, and I have lived here ever since. But I did not always know that I wanted to be a missionary. As a matter of fact, that was my sister. My sister knew all growing up that she was going to be a missionary. My brother knew all growing up that he was going to be a pastor. But I never really had a strong call from God on my life to full-time ministry. I knew that I would be in full-time ministry to some capacity, but I really didn't know what that was going to look like. I didn't have a clear idea like my siblings did. I actually wanted to grow up to record albums and do concerts. I loved to sing. I began taking piano lessons when I was 8 years old. When I attended Bible school, I enrolled in a music program, and voice was my first instrument. And ironically, today I struggle to sing at all because of some of the chronic health issues that I have. But one thing was clear from about the time that I was a senior in high school, and that was that I did not want to be a missionary. I took a missions trip with my dad, and we traveled around. I think it was a 10-day trip, and we traveled around Europe. We landed in Germany, we went to Austria, what was then still the Czechoslovakia. We went to Poland, and then back into Germany. And it was a 10-day trip that was about 8 days too long. I really struggled because back then you really couldn't drink the tap water, and all I wanted was a tall glass of water. All of the food was just foreign to me. I missed everything that was familiar, and I just really struggled with the fact that everything was, centuries old. Some things were thousands of years old, and I just wanted to go back to America. And when we landed in America, I said, I know for a fact that God hasn't called me to be a missionary, because if I was called to be a missionary, that would have been much more enjoyable than it was. And I think that somewhere deep inside of me, I felt that if I said that loud enough and enough times, that God wouldn't do the most horrible thing imaginable and call me to be a missionary. Well, he did just that. My summer semester in Bible school. And here I am in Bible school. I was in my summer semester. It was my first year. And in the school that I went to, you were required to do one summer semester in order to graduate. And I chose, the options basically were do a missions trip, do an archaeology dig, or do the on-site youth camp, which was, I think, 3 or 4 youth camps, one right after another, and they lasted pretty much the entire summer semester. And I opted for the youth camp because traveling to an overseas country was completely out of the question for me. I was there in Bible school. I had begun to really walk away from the Lord because I knew that there was a call on my life, and I really didn't want all of the requirements that came with that. Namely, I really didn't want to live at a higher standard, as you know, so many times we are required to do, and really not just required to do because we are in ministry. We're required to live at a higher standard because we're Christians. But you know, I was just in a state of rebellion at that point, and so I really wasn't going to have it. So because I really didn't feel like I wanted to surrender everything to God, you know, you don't get to pick and choose the areas of your life that you surrender to God. You are either fully surrendered, or you're going to live in this place with a huge wall between you and God. And that's really where I found myself, being there in Bible school. And so ironically, I was probably about the furthest away from God being in Bible school than I ever had been in my life. And in my summer semester, working at the youth camp, the theme for that year was the persecuted church. And it was during one of the evening sessions that I strongly felt God calling me to missions. And it was the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to me. The youth camp leader was also my home group leader because we went to the same church. And so that weekend when I was at home group, I cornered him and I shared with him the experience that I had and the fact that I really felt that God was calling me to missions. And I think down inside, I was hoping that he was going to sort of like poo-poo it and say, oh, that was just an emotional experience. You know, it's probably nothing. That is not what he said. He encouraged me to consider taking a short-term mission trip and consider really pursuing that, and asking God to confirm that. Well, that wasn't at all what I was going to do, because I didn't want God to confirm it, because I didn't want it to be true in the first place. So I walked away from that conversation, and that was, you know, and I determined in myself that I was just going to ignore what happened to me. And that was the moment when I really just turned my back fully on God, and I went headlong into a rebellion for the next year. It was the following summer. I was home with my parents and, you know, trying to earn more money to go back to school. Those of you who know my parents know just how godly they are. And it was impossible for me to be under their roof and really in the backslidden state that I was in, because there was so much conviction in my heart, and I knew where I was at, and I knew that I could not continue on the way that I was continuing. And so I began to slowly return back to God. And by the end of that summer, I had really truly repented, but it was going to take a little bit of time before I would really be fully surrendered to God the way that I needed to be. I finished out that summer semester, or that last year of Bible school, and it was shortly thereafter that I went to Croatia to visit my sister. For those of you who don't know, my sister came to Croatia in 1999, and here she met her husband, and they were about to be married in the summer of 2001. I was just coming off of a pretty rough final year of school. I was working 4 different part-time jobs to cover my bill, because at the Bible school that I chose to attend, you had to pay your school bill in full before you could walk. And so in order to fully pay my school bill, I was working 4 part-time jobs, and I had a lot of classes that year. And so I was really just burning the candle at both ends. And so I finished school, I graduated, I got in my car, and my mom and I drove back. It took about 4 days to drive from Dallas, Texas to Spokane, Washington, where my parents were now pastoring. In the meantime, they had left their church in Portland, Oregon, and were planting a church in Spokane. And so we arrived, I believe it was a Friday, possibly a Saturday, and we unpacked our bags and repacked our bags, and Sunday afternoon we were on an airplane headed for Rome, Italy. And we were going to land in Rome. We were going to take a couple days to sightsee around Rome, then take a train to Zagreb and spend time there helping my sister do her final wedding preparations, and then celebrate with her as she got married to her husband. And it was a whirlwind of a trip. I do remember that. And I was exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted. And we got on the plane heading back home after her wedding. And I looked at my parents and I said, I am never going back there again. If my sister ever wants to see me, she's going to have to come visit the States, because I am never going back there again. And wouldn't you know it, only 2 years later, I would be looking at my parents across the breakfast table saying, I'm going to go spend a month with my sister in Croatia. And I remember my parents saying, look, if you're not having a good time, a month can be a very long time. And I was determined, though, that I was going to do that. You see, my final year in Bible school, I had gotten into a relationship with a young man. And I knew clearly, I can take you to the place, I can tell you the time of day that it was when God told me, do not pursue that relationship, run away. But in my foolishness and in my hard-headedness, and even though I had come back to the Lord, this was an area of my life that I still had not fully surrendered. And I turned my back on that, and I went headlong into that relationship. And it was so toxic. My last year of Bible school was a mixture of stress because I was working so many jobs and having so many classes, but also stress because I was in a very abusive relationship. It was verbally abusive, it was psychologically abusive, and my roommates were very concerned. And I remember them sitting down with me a couple of times talking to me about this relationship and how they really felt it was super toxic and that I wasn't being treated with the respect that I should be treated with. And by the time I graduated from Bible school and I had come back and I was living in Spokane, Washington with my parents, we had broken up already a couple of times. And we got back together for the 3rd time. Following that, we got engaged, and it just went from bad to worse. After our engagement, the abuse just really heightened, and I was so miserable. I had never been as miserable probably as I was at that time in my life. And I was confused because I thought that this was supposed to be the most beautiful time, planning my wedding, and here I was just so miserable. And there were times that I would, at night, I would lay down and I would just comb over every moment of that day just to see, had I done anything or said anything or talked to anyone, whatever. Had I done anything that was going to make him angry? And was I going to have to endure another period of the silent treatment? It was really, really a difficult time in my life. And so coming out of that, I walked away from that relationship for a final time. I broke off our engagement, and it was very emotional. It was on the heels of that I just sort of wanted to get away. And there were, I was wanting to just sort of clear my head and everything. And so I decided to go and visit my sister for a month. So it was in the late spring of 2003 that I boarded the plane to go visit my sister. And it was during that time that God, first of all, spoke to me what it was in my heart and inside of me that kept leading me back into that really, really bad relationship, and what it was that was going to keep me from getting into another relationship just like that. But also, it was during that time that he really showed me this was an area in my life that I hadn't fully surrendered, and that if I would fully surrender everything in my life to him, that he was going to redeem that call that he had given me to missions, and that it was going to lead me into a whole new area of my life. And that's exactly what happened. And I knew God was calling me to come back here and to partner with my sister and her husband in the church that they pastor here in Zagreb, Croatia. And it was the most beautiful thing. I spent the final 2 weeks of my trip here crying every single day. And I remember my sister going, "Are you okay? Are you sure you're okay?" And I was like, "I am." And it was such a cleansing. It was through all of those tears from that just 2 weeks of crying and weeping every single day that I knew God was just completely cleansing me of all of that gunk that had really accumulated in that time. And so I returned back home in June of 2003, and I would follow my parents from Spokane, Washington to Bowman, North Dakota, and back to Portland, Oregon in that next year. And in that time, just getting my affairs in order and trimming down all of the stuff that I had, packing my bags, and moving here to Zagreb, Croatia. And that's how I came here. That's how God redeemed my call. So the takeaway really from this is that if you know that in some area in your life, God is asking you to surrender. When he called me to missions at that summer camp at Bible school, I felt like it was the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. I thought God was completely ruining my life. But I have to say, I have been here now for, it will be 18 years in August. And I can truly say that even though this is not a call that I ever chose, this was not a call that I ever wanted, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. There is something to be said for living in the absolute center of God's will. There's such a joy. There is such a satisfaction. There is such beauty in that. And so if you know that there's maybe an area in your life where you have resisted God's call and you're wanting to redeem that, he will. What it requires for us is to completely surrender the right to have the last word in our own destiny. For many of us, we grew up with that philosophy that you can be whatever you want to be. To be really honest, when we surrender our lives to God, we surrender that area of our life too, where we surrender the right to be what we want to be, and we become what God has called us to be. And so if maybe there's an area in your life where you've been resistant in that area, I want to put a challenge to you today to surrender your life fully and completely and give God the final say in what it is that you do with your life, in whatever capacity that may be. And I promise you that if you will do that, it will bring you to a place of full and complete satisfaction. And I can say that from the perspective of someone who is definitely living out a call that I would have never chosen, that I would have never wanted, but that I wouldn't trade for the world. So that's how I came to be here in Croatia. Perhaps in the next video, I will share with you how I met my husband and some of the enormous differences in, culturally and historically and pretty much in every way that we have in our life story, and how we have managed to take those two different cultures and all of those differences and marry them into one very beautiful marriage. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.